Holy Writ, and the Israelis, who have a very different experience of combat from what most of the Western European and American nations in America have reported. So, do you have any comment, any further comment, on the relationship of these legal kinds of debates over proportionality, and what you would want to say about proportionality from a philosophical perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely recognize that there's additional Protocol 1, it has got a clause about proportionality, and the different militaries of the world interpret that differently. And it causes problems for coalition fighting, because very often I think the United States has felt constrained by the interpretations of proportionality of some of its potential allies, which are more restrictive than the US interpretation. So the US thinks, I think the practice is that there's a coalition, you fight according to you do only the things that everybody thinks are permissible to do. And so the United States feels bound, restricted in its, the ways it can wage war if it's in alliance with militaries who have a more restrictive interpretation of proportionality. I mean, one of the problems I understand about the legal situation is there's never been a prosecution under the heading of in bello proportionality. You know, Human Rights Watch can write reports saying that proportionality has been violated, but there's never been any legal determination.
But
so
there have been investigations.
I'm quoting a lawyer who told me this, so I bow to others' greater knowledge. But I think there haven't been definitive legal interpretations of that part of Additional Protocol 1 because there haven't been prosecutions. And it's easier to prosecute under the heading of what I call necessity. It's easier to show that you caused an unnecessary level of harm, that you could have achieved your objective in a less harmful way. That's easier to show in a prosecution than it is to show there was no other way you could have done it, but what you did was disproportionate. So I mean, those are the facts on the ground. I mean, as a philosopher, I just try to think about the concept of excessive harm and come up with the best understanding of it I can come up with. Now, you would hope that when they come to interpret the clauses in Protocol 1, they'll engage in the same reasoning. Can't be made completely precise, that they'd come up with the best answer, but they haven't done it yet. Maybe the philosophers thinking about what proportionality involves can guide the lawyers when it comes time to interpret it in a more definitive way. But I think, if I think about the issue, I'm trying to think about just as what's morally right. If I'm thinking about whether a use of force is disproportionate, how should I come to a conclusion about that? And exactly what the wording of the law is, and exactly what the existing interpretations. It's something I'll look at and I'll respect, but I'm not going to be completely constrained by it the way a legal interpretation would have to be. I don't know if that's a satisfactory answer, but.
Thank you very much. First, as someone who's besieged by necessity to leave early this afternoon, I want to say thank you to Art and George for this fantastic program. It's I think I've never had one day with so many useful perspectives from so many knowledgeable people. So thank you, and also thanks to George for your kind nod to our historical work. I'll tell Andrew who edited that excellent chapter on Cicero. Just a few quick comments. First, I think that Bill Shaw's paper is useful and challenging. It's always important, though, inspired by someone like Jim Johnson, to remember that when much of the just war tradition was developed, we didn't really work in terms of what is utilitarianism and what is deontology. These are, to a large extent, conceptions developed after Kant. I have students who ask, how can Thomas Aquinas say this? He was a virtue ethicist, wasn't he? Well, that's something we thought of. So obviously, in a lot of the classical just war tradition, you will find utilitarian and deontological reasoning and virtue ethical reasoning side by side. And maybe that's part of the strength of that kind of reasoning with some of these thinkers, such as Augustine as well, who Dean Alshine has written well on. Secondly, there is one thing that we haven't really talked about when it comes to harms that are relevant. Well, it's right underneath there, but I think if you look back to early Christian and medieval Christian just war tradition, they would say that's a very relevant harm, namely what happens to the soldiers, and more broadly, what happens to us when we go into war. Augustine's classical question in Contra Faustum about what is really to be blamed about war. What is to be blamed is what happens to us. Our virtue is somehow destroyed. Now, that can be, of course, taken the other way, because many have said war is a good thing. It introduces discipline and pride and patriotism. But of course, when you, in the era of actual results of war. They clearly count. You said so as well, that what happens to soldiers clearly counts. And I think that's relevant to Michael Walzer's excellent lunchtime talk as well. You know, what is it about the good guys that they shouldn't do? Well, maybe the good guys end up being bad guys if they start doing these things. So it's something that happens to us. Finally, we'd like to recommend a piece by Avery Claw in the first issue of last year's, surprise, Journal of Military Ethics, which is a conversation in many ways. It's Michael Walzer's argument against Asa Kasher's argument on whether we should impose the responsibility to take on more risk. And it's the attempt by a commander to tell his soldier that you should go into this building, even though there will be more risk to itself, rather than us bombarding it. And I know there's more risk, but nonetheless we believe it's right. And I think that dialogue that he has there, very platonic, I think it's quite elegant. Also like to hear at some point, but we don't have time for that now, I'm sure Tom Hurd can talk a little bit about the proportionality of cost, which some people emphasize, saying that this cost isn't grave enough to go to war. Sometimes ad bellum proportionality is construed in that way, rather than proportionality of ends. But I don't know if that might.
Yeah, no, you can think that there's, that to count as a just cause, something has to reach a certain level of seriousness. You don't even do a proportionality calculation unless you've got something that's that serious. I could say, I mentioned that there were these conditional just causes. Another one that I didn't have time to mention was the writing of lesser humanitarian wrongs. So, you know, take the Afghanistan war. You know, the Taliban regime restricted the rights of Afghan women. And I think most people would think that a war fought just to end the restrictions of Afghan women's rights would not have been justified. It's not enough to justify war. And it's not that it was a just cause, but the war would be disproportionate. That's not enough to be a just cause. But you might think that once there's another just cause, the fact that, and just cause that permits regime change, as was sought in Afghanistan, then the fact that regime change would also improve the situation of Afghan women was a relevant benefit. Can I say something heretical about Augustine? I think that remark that what matters is you know, the effect on our virtue, I think that's morally horrible. The bad thing about war isn't that people get killed, it isn't that people get maimed and suffer horribly, it's that my soul is corrupted. I think that's morally horrible.
You know, I think you're
right.
misstating.
Well, I'm taking it, the way it's quoted and the way it was quoted here. I agree that I totally agree that if a war has corrupting effects on our characters, on the character of our political life, if the political life in our nation will be corrupted as a result of our fighting a war that would otherwise have a just cause, that is a relevant evil to be taken into account. I just don't think it counts alongside the deaths of thousands of people.
I think Augustine could answer that.
I think you could answer it, yeah, because I think the way you stated this is fairly simplistic. It's a far more complicated argument on his part, but there are other people with hands up, so we'll talk
So
about
is
that.
darn crypto pacifists.
Yeah, so I just wondered if I could maybe try and reconcile Bill and George a little bit. So, on the one hand, so George, you're giving an interpretation of last resort that is procedural rather than the way that I would tend to think about the requirement of necessity, which roughly says don't do it unless there's no other less costly way of doing it. And so on the one hand, that kind of seems an odd way to interpret the requirement. If you think about in terms of technology, so imagine some kind of super new technology that enables us from space to zap down rays that will kill all and only those involved in a genocide, right? Complete with no risk at all to anyone else. And then you say, well, should you be restrained from using that weapon simply because there was some other diplomatic channel that might have the effect of, that seems odd, right? I mean, if you really know that it's going to have that, welfare maximizing effect, why would you have to wait in terms of that procedural requirement of last resort? But I think that your interpretation becomes a lot more plausible when you kind of ask the question, why is it that we're consistently so bad at assessing the future costs of warfare, right? Time and time again, we think it's going to be quick, easy, cost-free, troops will be home by Christmas, strap on the bomber jacket, mission accomplished.
Cakewalk, I believe, is the phrase. Cakewalk.
Cakewalk, exactly. And I think that the reason for that is that the fundamental insight that Clausewitz had, which I think has not been undermined by all of these new technologies, which is that war has an intrinsic tendency towards escalation, precisely because it is a form of opposed political violence. When we start using organized violence against people, they will fight back against you, and it will always be more costly than you think it is. So whatever your assessment is of likely cost at the beginning of the conflict, treble it or quadruple it. And I think that probably does push you towards giving a lot more plausibility to your procedural interpretation of last resort.
A couple of responses. I'm certainly sympathetic to that, and certainly a more intuitively plausible way of initially at least making the case I'm trying to make about last resort would be to say something like what you just summarized, David, that in fact our ability to carry out, I guess the utilitarians call them expected values calculations, is notoriously suspect. Risk analysis, if you will. No matter how elaborate the models we use, how pseudo-mathematical they may seem to us in the financial world, for example, that we tend to overestimate the benefits of the policy that we're predisposed to pursue and discount the likely risks of the downsides of those policies. And we see it enough that the utilitarian would say, on a kind of John Stuart Mill account, the collective wisdom and experience of humankind has taught us this harsh lesson. And that's, by the way, how last resort, in virtually all the literature, I didn't have time to do it here, but I had like enormous sets of quotations of what various authors have said about the last resort criterion, and invariably if they try to summarize it, it's something like that. It's a collective wisdom of humankind has taught us that this is always worse than we think it's going to be. Therefore, don't do it. Or don't do it until you've tried all other alternatives. Now, the reason that I'm worried about simply letting it lie there is that for the first time, and I think this is fair to say, the vector of technological development in warfare has invariably been more destruction and more indiscriminate destruction, from the bow and arrow to the catapult to gunpowder to cannons to nuclear war. It's been widening the specter of destructiveness and the destructive power of war. Recently, starting with the development of precision-guided munitions around the time of Gulf War I, and now especially if you listen to the rhetoric of engineers involved in the development of new military technologies in the areas of robotics, let's say, and cyber war. This is a very important argument in the cyber case. These will offer far more discriminate and less destructive ways of carrying it out. So they'll be like your death ray from space. And I would say, I mean, for one thing, it strikes me as odd that a person who is concerned about rights and subject to killing and liability to being killed in general as a concern about war would be happy with the scenario you just described, where a death ray zapped only, a handful of people who were going to be responsible for a genocide, but hadn't yet carried it out. So therefore had done nothing to make themselves liable to attack yet. So we're going to kill them surgically. I mean, it seems to me that's not entirely consistent with your own position on vulnerability to attack. Yeah, right. Yeah, okay, yes, I know we can probably sketch it, but I'd say, well, have we first, it seems reasonable to ask, is there some other way apart from killing them that we can stop this? Because who knows why they're doing this? They may be poisoned, if we're going to carry the philosophical game out a bit. They may have inhaled some kind of hallucinogenic drug by accident that was released by a chemical plant that we built to help provide for development. And who knows what's going on? And so one doesn't necessarily, either in domestic law enforcement or I think in this case, the international arena, necessarily say, oh, they're about to do something terrible, let's zap them. You first ask, they're about to do something terrible, we think, can we stop them? And if the answer is, well, no, and they're going to kill, hundreds of thousands of people with machetes, well,